to have my narrative ripped from me and turned into the Starr Report, and things that were turned over or things they delved out of my computer that I thought were deleted. I mean, it was just a violation after violation.
That interview comes from the new National Geographic three-part special, The 90s, The Last Great Decade. Earlier, I spoke to David Sirota, a contributor to the program, about the Lewinsky scandal and how the 90s defines us even in the middle of 2014. David, thanks for joining us. The series is called The 90s, The Last Great Decade. Let's start right there. Was this the last great decade, you think?
Well, we asked the question in this show, and I think the question is a good one. And I think to a lot of people who were voices in the show, they would say yes. And I think the poll that came out about the 1990s that just came out says that a lot of Americans think it was the last great decade as well. I think that's because there were a lot of really good things that happened in the 90s. The economy was expanding. There were push for more rights for people. There was a lot of good things that happened in the 90s. There was the expansion of the internet. But I think that the consequences of a lot of the excess of the 90s wasn't felt until after the 1990s were over. So in hindsight, the 1990s looks like a time where the problems we faced were relatively small. The Cold War was over. We weren't at war. And we didn't face the kinds of problems sizably that we face today. But I think there's an argument that we're dealing with a lot of the hangover of the 1990s still right now in this era.
Well, that's one of the things I wonder about, is whether the 90s were built on a foundation of sand. You have the bust of the dot-com bubble, and arguments made on the show include that the 90s were, in a way, a vacation from history. Were we naive in the 90s, perhaps?
I certainly think there was a lot of naivete in the 1990s. We were deregulating Wall Street, and obviously that came crashing down, and the financial collapse a lot later, farther after the 90s. There was the dot-com bubble. We may be in the middle of a dot-com bubble now. There were signs of a threat of terrorism with the World Trade Center bombing. There was Columbine, which I think was a warning on a lot of the gun issues that we're now still dealing with. And I think that there was obviously the end of the Cold War, which gave Americans a sense of global security, and obviously we've seen that that's not necessarily the case anymore.
David, you're one of the many contributors for the show. There were a slew of high-profile people interviewed for this, cast members from The Real World, Christopher Darden, the assistant district attorney who tried O.J. Simpson for murder, Monica Lewinsky, of course. What did she specifically have to say about the Clinton affair and about the 90s?
Well, she provided some insight into what she was thinking about during the impeachment, and I think she made a lot of points about how she said she didn't expect nearly the media attention that it generated. Now you could say, well, how could you not expect that if it came out in the media? But I think what she reminds us of is that was really a time when tabloid news became political news, and the boundaries between what we call tabloid news and quote-unquote serious news, it sort of blurred into what we have now, which there really aren't any boundaries at all.
Let's play a clip from the show. This is where you describe this shift of how we, the media, covered all these things.
At the beginning of the 1990s, there's still a distinction between tabloid culture and news. Those two things mean different things. By the end of the 1990s, there's no distinction between what's tabloid news and what's news.
Where do you think that began? Was it with Tonya Harding, Nancy Kerrigan? Was it with Monica Lewinsky?
I think it was all those things. I mean, I think even the O.J. Simpson trial was a real trial. It was a real criminal justice matter, but it became covered in such a 24/7 kind of way that it really transcended to dominate the news. And now there are no boundaries. I mean, the Princess Diana death and how that was covered. Princess Diana was a kind of a tabloid figure who then became a huge news figure in general. There wasn't that distinction anymore, and that's the world we live in in now, and I think it's actually exacerbated now by the fact that the technology that came out of the 1990s with the internet then ultimately became the internet in your pocket, and now everybody can post video to the internet, and so it only increases the idea that we're living in a world where what's TV and what's real, what's tabloid news and what's serious news, all these things are in one mishmash.
The three-night miniseries, The 90s, The Last Great Decade, premieres Sunday, July 6th, 9 p.m. David Sirota, thank you so much.